Excellencies, distinguished participants, let me open the 36th meeting of the 52nd session of the Human Rights Council. We shall now begin the interactive dialogue with the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. It's my pleasure to welcome the distinguished members of the Commission, Mr. Mohamed Chande Othman, Ms. Radhika Kumaraswamy, and Mr. Stephen Ratner. I now give the floor to the Chair of the Commission, Mr. Mohamed Chande Othman, who is going to introduce the session. Sir, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates and observers, thank you for this opportunity to brief the Council on the work of the UN International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, pursuant to Human Rights Council Resolution 51/27 of 7th October 2022. I serve as the new chairman of the Commission, and I wish to take this opportunity also to introduce my co-commissioners, Mr. Stephen Ratner of the United States of America and Ms. Radhika Kumaraswamy of Sri Lanka. As members are aware, the Commission has a twofold mandate to investigate and report on alleged violations of international human rights, humanitarian and refugee law since November 2020, and to provide advice regarding transitional justice. In carrying out our mandate, we have consistently sought to work with and reached out to engage with the government of Ethiopia, partners in the African Union, and civil society actors. Since the Commission presented its first report to the Council in September last year, the situation in Ethiopia has evolved significantly. On 2nd of November, the federal government and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLL, signed a cessation of hostilities agreement at ending more than 2 years of armed conflict that has affected millions of women, men, and children in the Tigray, Afar, and Amhara regions of northern Ethiopia. Since then, the region has witnessed a significant and so far sustained reduction in conflict. The Commission greatly welcomes the cessation of hostilities agreement and subsequent agreement regarding the implementation. We especially welcome the commitment to human rights, protection of civilians, unhindered humanitarian access, and accountability. The Commission looks forward to such efforts being sustained countrywide. Since the conclusion of the agreement, the federal government has embarked on a series of initiatives that offer a first step towards the locally owned transitional justice process. This includes the current consultation on its green paper, policy option for transitional justice. But it's too early to assess progress. We are hopeful that these and other national processes contribute towards inclusive, gender-responsive, victim and survivor-centered approaches to accountability, truth-telling and reconciliation, reparation, as well as the establishment of necessary policies for non-recurrence of violence. Mr. President, Excellencies, despite these positive developments and relatively improved security, we must not forget the gravity and scale of the violations committed in Ethiopia since November 2020. Our 2022 September report found reasonable grounds to believe that all parties to the conflict had committed war crimes and violation of abuses of human rights since fighting erupted in November 2020. The Commission continues to investigate these allegations in addition to alleged allegations of serious violation and abuses committed since the signing of the peace agreement. The Commission stresses that independent investigations and accountability for such acts is essential, not just for justice for survivors, victims and their families, but also to deter commission of future violations and abuses. Under international law, the federal government has the primary responsibility to ensure accountability for crimes committed during the conflict. In that regard, we note initiatives to investigate and prosecute alleged perpetrators of serious crimes, including through the Ministry of Justice and the Interministerial Task Force, IMTF. We urge the federal government to ensure greater transparency around these efforts and stand ready to offer advice in this regard. We remain concerned about a lack of pathways for accountability for serious violations committed by Eritrean forces. Mr. President, Excellencies, allow me to provide a brief update on the status of our work. The General Assembly approved the proposed budget for the Commission, and we are currently onboarding new staff members. Since we last briefed the Council, we have continued our consultation with a wide range of stakeholders to inform our investigation priorities and strategy. Regarding the geographical scope, our investigations addressed alleged violations in Tigray, Afar, Amhara, and Oromia regions. Regarding the material scope, in addition to the serious offenses discussed in our first report, notably attack on civilians, sexual and gender-based violence, and denial of humanitarian access, we are also addressing other violations such as arbitrary detention, violation of children's rights, and hate speech. As required by our mandate, we are investigating alleged violation by all parties, including Eritrean forces operating on Ethiopian territory. To date, the Commission has held in-depth interviews with victims, survivors, and witnesses, and this approach is complemented by open-source investigations and geospatial and satellite imagery analysis. We continue to place a strong emphasis on integrating a gender perspective in addition to the unique and intergenerational impact of conflict on children. However, we regret to note that to date, and despite repeated requests, the Ethiopian government has not yet allowed our investigation teams to the country. As a result, much of our work is being carried out remotely, so we strongly urge the government to reconsider its decision not to cooperate with the Commission. Similarly, we encourage Member States to assist in facilitating access for the Commission to Ethiopia as well as to countries hosting refugees. The Commission, pursuant to its mandate from this Council, continues to establish the facts and circumstances surrounding alleged violations and abuses both in the past and ongoing, and to collect and preserve evidence accessible and usable in support of ongoing and future accountability efforts. Regarding our transitional justice mandate, we are closely reviewing the policy options document in detail, as well as the consultation process, in particular with respect to international and regional standards. We encourage wide-ranging and exclusive consultation to ensure the wishes of survivors, victims, and others affected communities are reflected. We reiterate our commitment to provide expert and technical advice to the government of Ethiopia, the National Dialogue Commission, and other domestic stakeholders. We continue to engage with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the East Africa Regional Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to discuss areas of potential cooperation and information sharing, and hope to see further progress in the near future. We have also engaged with states in the African Union and others following the situation in Ethiopia. Mr. President, Excellencies, the conclusion of the peace agreement between the government and TPLF is an important step. The need to investigate alleged violations both before and since the peace agreement raises an important as ever to increasing and creating a durable peace with full respect for human rights. An overwhelming message from our engagement with survivors, victims, and witnesses is their desire for greater awareness of the harm they have suffered and a resounding call for sustainable peace and justice. Many express a strong conviction that peace and justice are two mutually reinforcing objectives. One cannot exist without the other, a position shared by the Commission and this Council. One man displaced from his village, detained for more than a year, and unable to return to his home, told us recently, "I want to go back to my old village, but first I need to see peace. It needs to be safe to return home, but right now it is not. After peace, we need support, humanitarian and other assistance, so we may rebuild our lives. And then we need justice. Those who committed crimes should not be able to do it again. And finally, we need awareness. We need the world to know what happened to us. It cannot be forgotten. We shall not be forgotten." I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank you, sir. According to our practice, we will start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned. So it's my pleasure to invite the distinguished representative of Ethiopia, Ambassador. You have the floor, and you have 5 minutes, please.
Mr. President, Ethiopia is focused on the full implementation of the agreement for lasting peace through a permanent cessation of hostilities signed in Pretoria, the Republic of South Africa, on the 2nd of November 2022 through an African Union convened process. This agreement has stopped the conflict and all forms of hostilities. The second pillar of the implementation is a significant increase in humanitarian aid and restoration of services. Another pillar is disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former combatants. These undertakings are being overseen by the African Union Monitoring, Verification and Compliance Mechanism. On the 10th of March 2023, the National Tahadso, or Rehabilitation Commission, held consultations in Mekelle on the demobilization and reintegration of former combatants. The agreement has also provided transitional measures, which include adopting a transitional justice policy to ensure accountability, truth-telling, redress for victims, healing, and reconciliation. On 6 March 2023, the inaugural ceremony for the nationwide consultations was held. On the 16th of March, a workshop for experience and expertise sharing was held involving speakers from different countries, organizations, and academicians in the field. These measures further consolidate the work of the Interministerial Task Force implementing the joint recommendations of UNOHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. The UNOHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, at the request of the government, are supporting the nationwide consultations on transitional justice and will jointly deploy human rights monitors to conflict-affected areas. In the meantime, we call on the International Commission of Human Rights Experts to take extra care in the period until September, when it will submit its final report, not to repeat the kinds of inflammatory and unfounded allegations contained in its preliminary report, with the potential to undermine the peace agreement, stability and durable peace in Ethiopia. Finally, Mr. President, I reiterate the firm commitment of the government of Ethiopia to investigate allegations of violations of human rights and humanitarian law, to ensure justice is done and victims receive redress. The remainder of my statement will be delivered at the conclusion of the interactive dialogue. I thank you.
I thank you, Excellency. Now let me invite the representative of the A-status National Human Rights Institution of Ethiopia, Mr. Daniel Bikele, Chief Commissioner of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. You have 3 minutes and you have the floor.
Distinguished President and members of the Human Rights Council, over the last few years, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission has been investigating, documenting, and reporting grave human rights violations in northern Ethiopia and other parts of the country. Despite ongoing human rights violations in parts of the country, my commission is encouraged by the Pretoria Peace Agreement for lasting peace and cessation of hostilities. Our commission particularly welcomes the agreement's provision to establish a comprehensive national transitional justice policy aimed at accountability, ascertaining the truth, redress for victims, reconciliation and healing. We are further encouraged by the launching of the national consultation in Ethiopia on transitional justice policy options. This is fully in line with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Human Rights Office joint investigation that has established serious human rights violations in Ethiopia and recommendations on transitional justice. Between July and December of last year, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, together with the UN Human Rights Office, spoke to over 700 victims of human rights violations, their families, internally displaced persons and community leaders on their views and aspirations on accountability, truth, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence. We have published the key findings of these community consultations and wish to echo what they indicated are their primary needs, which include to live without fear, to have peace and security, and reparations to get their lives back. Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, therefore, urges the Human Rights Council as well as the international community to support and coordinate efforts towards the proper designing and effective implementation of a genuine human rights compliant, holistic and victim-centered transitional justice policy for Ethiopia. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The list of speakers is now closed, and we will continue with interested delegations. So let me remind everybody that the speaking time is 1 minute and 30 seconds for all. And the first on my list is the delegation of the European Union. You have the floor.
The European Union thanks the Commission for its update and reiterates its strong support for its work. We welcome the signing of the Pretoria Peace Agreement and the Declaration and thank the AU and the High-Level Panel for their role. We commend the steps taken to date to implement the agreement and call for further progress on the implementation, continued and unimpeded humanitarian access and the further expansion of basic services in the conflict-related areas. Independent, transparent and impartial investigations are essential. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, OHCHR and the Commission have all been providing valuable input in this regard. We look forward to the final report of the Commission to be submitted to this Council in September. Looking forward, the EU welcomes the announcement that OHCHR will deploy human rights monitors to the conflict-affected areas and the commitment expressed by the government to implement a national transitional justice policy. Credible transitional justice and accountability processes are crucial to sustainable peace. We welcome the publication of a Green Paper, the launch of public consultations and the fact that the government has requested assistance from OHCHR in the design and implementation of a transitional justice framework that meets international standards. Commissioners, transitional justice is about coming to terms with the legacy of past abuses. How does your work fit into this? I thank you.
Thank you, and we will continue with Norway, speaking on behalf of a group of countries. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Nordic and Baltic countries thank the International Commission of Human Rights Experts for the briefing and for your valuable contribution. We are glad to see progress on the implementation of the Permanent Cessation of Hostilities Agreement of 2nd November 2022 and the agreement from the Senior Commanders meeting 12th November. Accountability and transitional justice must remain at the core of the peace process. We welcome the announcement by the Ethiopian Minister of Justice that the OHCHR will deploy human rights monitors to the conflict-affected areas in northern Ethiopia. Furthermore, we welcome the commitment by Ethiopia to implement a comprehensive national transitional justice policy. Cooperation with national and international human rights mechanisms on accountability and transitional justice is essential. Independent and credible documentation, investigation and prosecution of reported violations and abuses of international human rights law and violations of international humanitarian law are crucial for the victims and their communities and fundamental to ensure lasting reconciliation, peace and stability. In the Commission's view, how can we best engage with the government of Ethiopia and all stakeholders to achieve this? I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Cote d'Ivoire, speaking on behalf of the group of...
Mr. President, the African Group notes the oral update of the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia. The African Group welcomes the signing of the agreement for lasting peace through a permanent cessation of hostilities in Pretoria, South Africa on the 2nd November 2022 through an AU-convened peace process that silenced the guns in northern Ethiopia. We commend its strong emphasis on human rights and the commitment to a comprehensive national transitional justice process. We also welcome the measures taken by the parties to fully implement the agreement and deployment of the African team of experts as part of the launching of the African Union Monitoring, Verification, Compliance Mechanism. Steps are being taken to implement the agreement. In fulfilling its mandate, the International Commission must be mindful of the implementation of the peace agreement and domestic measures of accountability, including when submitting its final report, concluding this mandate coming in September. We call on the parties to continue to honor their commitments in good faith and to ensure the full implementation of the agreement within the agreed timeframes. We commend accountability measures taken by the government of Ethiopia, including the establishment of the Interministerial Task Force to implement the recommendations of the joint investigation by OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. Thank you.
Merci à vous, Monsieur, and we will continue with Liechtenstein. Ambassador.
Mr. President, we would like to thank the Commission as well for the oral briefing we got today, and we welcome the signing of the agreement also on the occasion of the hostilities and stress the importance of its full implementation, including when it comes to transitional justice. We thank the High Commissioner also for human rights and his office for the constructive engagement in this respect. Nonetheless, we share the concerns expressed by the High Commissioner that the human rights situation in Ethiopia remains concerning in many regions. It's of paramount importance also in this context that all conflict-related serious violations and abuses of international human rights law and violations of international humanitarian law are investigated and perpetrators are held accountable. We support the High Commission in stressing the need for continued monitoring and reporting, and we emphasize the important role the Commission of Human Rights experts plays in this regard. We call upon all parties to the conflict to grant the International Commission of Human Rights Experts in Ethiopia and its members unhindered access to the region and facilities under their control and to fully cooperate with the Commission. And we look forward to the Commission's report later this year. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Ireland.
Thank you. Ireland aligns with the EU statement and we thank the Commission for its update. We welcome the agreement on a permanent cessation of hostilities and commend both the Government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front on the progress already made in its implementation. The agreement marks a crucial and important step towards peace and reconciliation in Ethiopia. Ireland strongly supports the ongoing efforts towards the establishment of a credible transitional justice mechanism, which is critical for sustainable peace. Equally, we strongly encourage the Government of Ethiopia to ensure that accountability for all violations and abuses of human rights is prioritised. Cooperation by all parties with the OHCHR, the EHRC and other human rights monitoring and investigation mechanisms will help ensure independent, transparent and impartial investigations into all allegations of violations and abuses of human rights and accountability for victims and survivors. In this regard, the final report of the Commission in September will provide very valuable input. We welcome progress towards ensuring humanitarian assistance reaches all those in need and the restoration of essential services, and call for those measures to be urgently scaled up to ensure the immense needs of the population in northern Ethiopia are met. Commissioners, how can the international community support your mandate and the continuation of human rights monitoring and accountability efforts? Thank you.
Thank you. United States of America, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Commissioners. We welcome the tremendous progress since the signing of the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement by the Government of Ethiopia and the TPLF, including improved humanitarian access, delivery of essential services, and respect for human rights. We appreciate the Government of Ethiopia's invitations to OHCHR and EHRC to deploy international human rights monitors to conflict-affected areas, and its invitation to international experts to advise in the development of a comprehensive comprehensive transitional justice policy. We look forward to the government's cooperation with both bodies as well as with the international community. We urged the GOE to ensure unhindered access to the monitoring teams. Yesterday, the U.S. Secretary of State announced his determination that all parties to the conflict in northern Ethiopia committed atrocity crimes. An acknowledgement of the atrocity crimes that have been committed in the recent conflict is critical to supporting transitional justice efforts and enabling a lasting peace. We applaud the government's commitment to conduct broad public consultations to ensure its transitional justice policy reflects international best practices in the views of the Ethiopian people and is fully genuine, inclusive, credible, and comprehensive. We urge continued progress on human rights, justice, and accountability in Ethiopia beyond the Commission's final report, which will be presented at HRC 54. How can the Commission offer its transitional justice expertise to the government as it fulfills its commitments outlined in the agreement? I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now let me invite China.
Mr. President, as the anchor of the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia's sustained peace and stability is particularly meaningful for lasting peace in the region. China welcomes the conclusion of a permanent ceasefire agreement between the government and the TPLF and sincerely hopes that all parties concerned will put national and people's interests first, leveraging inclusive political dialogue to resolve differences and restore peace internally. China has always advocated a constructive dialogue and cooperation in resolving human rights-related differences. We oppose such a situation where some countries, in disregard of the Ethiopia's opposition, the active cooperation between Ethiopia and the UN Human Rights Mechanism and the human rights progress made in the country, have forcefully pushed for the establishment of country mechanism on Ethiopia, interfering in its internal affairs. This can only increase the complexity of the Ethiopia issue. Furthermore, the UCM imposed by some countries undermine gravely Ethiopian people's human rights and therefore must be lifted immediately. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And now let me invite Belgium, Ambassador.
Monsieur le Président, la Belgique
Belgium aligns with the EU statement. We thank the International Commission for its oral update and intensive work. We welcome the positive developments in Ethiopia since the renewal of the Commission's mandate. We are encouraged by the progress achieved in terms of ceasefire access, humanitarian access, and the obligation to report on violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. The request of Ethiopian authorities to the OHCHR for advice and human rights monitors on transitional justice and the recent publication of the Green Paper are encouraging. We call on the Ethiopian government to spare no efforts in this regard and to ensure transparent, independent and impartial investigations. Because the fight against impunity also means putting victims and survivors at the center of the debate, we reiterate the importance of ensuring that victims of violations and abuses have access to judicial proceedings. The situation in Ethiopia is also concerning with regard to the respect of individual freedoms. Human rights defenders continue to be threatened for having documented alleged violations and abuses. Can you tell us more about this, please? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. And now let me invite Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. We endorse the statement of the EU. We thank the International Commission of Experts for the oral update. Luxembourg welcomes the adoption of the Pretoria Agreement and the Nairobi Declaration, as well as the commitment of stakeholders to ensure their implementation. After 2 years of deadly conflict, the peace process needs continued efforts on both sides. As mentioned by the High Commissioner, the implementation of the agreement must be full, including in terms of transitional justice, DDR, and accountability. The provision of humanitarian assistance and the resumption of basic services are encouraging. However, in order to restore trust of the civilian population in state institutions, it must see that there's no impunity for the very serious violations of human rights perpetrated during the conflict. The work of the International Commission is in addition to the activities of national authorities and support provided by the High Commissioner. Luxembourg calls on the Ethiopian government to cooperate fully with the International Commission and to ensure that it has access it needs to exercise its mandate. We reiterate also our call to Eritrea to withdraw all its troops from Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. And now let me invite Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, Switzerland would like to thank the International Commission of Experts for the report. Switzerland praises the signing of the ceasefire agreement between the government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front last November. We recognize the important positive developments that took place in terms of security, human rights, as well as ensuring humanitarian access and to basic services in the north of Ethiopia. We encourage all parties to continue their efforts. To create a foundation for sustainable peace, it is crucial to respect human rights and to render justice for violations and attacks on international law carried out by all parties in the country. Switzerland encourages the government of Ethiopia to continue to take measures to develop the process of transitional justice in a transparent, inclusive, impartial, and participative manner. Switzerland remains concerned by the continuing violence in other parts of the country. We call upon all actors to respect human rights. We praise the constructive cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and we call upon the government to continue this cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. And we continue with Canada. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Canada thanks the Commission for this update and for its crucial ongoing work in investigating and documenting human rights violations and abuses committed during the conflict in Ethiopia. We call on all to cooperate with its mandate. The collaborative human rights work of the OHCHR and the EHRC is critical to Ethiopia's future for accountability and lasting reconciliation. Canada is pleased to support this work. Canada also supports the African Union-led peace process and welcomes the progress made to date by the government and people of Ethiopia on the implementation of the Permanent Cessation of Hostilities Agreement. We eagerly anticipate full, unimpeded access for the provision of humanitarian assistance and the restoration of critical services. Continuing progress on the agreement and national accountability mechanisms, coupled with international independent and impartial investigative mechanisms, builds trust and strengthens the foundation for sustainable peace in Ethiopia. Canada welcomes the government of Ethiopia's commitment to meeting international human rights standards and the publication of its first draft policy options for transitional justice. We encourage the Ethiopian government to strengthen domestic human rights institutions and partnerships with the international community to deliver justice and accountability for victims and survivors. We stand ready to support Ethiopia in these efforts. Esteemed experts, how can the international community best encourage strengthening Ethiopia's domestic human rights institutions and processes? Thank you.
I thank you, and I'm passing the floor to India.
Mr. President, we have been following the developments in the Tigray region and the consequent humanitarian situation closely. We welcome the agreement for lasting peace through permanent cessation of hostilities signed between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. We welcome the steps taken by the Ethiopian government for facilitating the work of humanitarian agencies to provide relief and the resumption of basic services following the peace agreement. We also welcome the Ethiopian government's steps to cooperate with the OHCHR and the measures taken to implement the recommendations contained in the joint investigation report by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commissioner and the OHCHR. We note Ethiopia's efforts towards fulfillment of its international and national human rights obligations. In this regard, we note the statement of the Ethiopian government affirming its commitment to undertake thorough investigations and bring those responsible for the violations to justice. In conclusion, India reiterates its strong commitment to the unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia and support for its efforts towards addressing the situation in the Tigray region. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And we will continue with a video statement by Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Thank you, President. Venezuela did not support the resolution that created this mandate and that led to this meeting. Ethiopia rejected that mandate, reiterating its readiness to continue frank dialogue on the basis of equality. We support the efforts of the Ethiopian government to return to normality in the country with specific steps as the lifting of the state of emergency, declaration of an indefinite humanitarian ceasefire, and the freeing of detained persons. Ethiopia continues openly to cooperate with the Council and its mechanisms, providing information about the situation in the country, and reaffirmed its readiness to continue to comply with recommendations in the joint report that was presented, and we have to support that. And we cannot support the imposition of hostile mechanisms of monitoring that are doomed to fail. Mr. President, my country, always committed to peace, friendship, and solidarity between all countries in the world, will continue to promote a peaceful settlement of disputes on the base of principles of respect of sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs enshrined in the UN Charter. The community of nations should support any initiative that will help lead to stability in Ethiopia, acting always with the consent and agreement that this government should take in total sovereignty. Thank you.
Let me invite the distinguished representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Ambassador. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia for its important work. We congratulate Ethiopia on achievements so far in the peace process and the political willingness that both parties have shown to implement the Pretoria and Nairobi agreements. We also welcome the accord between the government of Ethiopia and the TPLF to establish a transitional justice mechanism as mentioned in the Pretoria Agreement. It is positive that Ethiopia is working on transitional justice together with the local office of OHCHR and is planning to set up national mechanisms to take this forward. All parties to the conflict should continue to investigate and bring to justice members of its forces who have committed serious violations of international human rights law and humanitarian law. The Netherlands stresses that accountability for human rights violations remains an integral part of the process of building peace. Involvement of the Human Rights Council can help support important national efforts by adding international credibility and accompanying the parties throughout this important process. To the Commissioners, my question: what can the Human Rights Council do to further help anchor accountability in future national efforts towards transitional justice? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And now let me invite the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. The UK commends the progress that the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front have made towards implementing the November 2022 Pretoria Peace Agreement, ending 2 years of conflict. We welcome progress on disarmament, the withdrawal of Eritrean forces, and humanitarian access to Tigray. Ensuring justice for the victims of atrocities committed during the conflict and holding those who perpetrated these accountable are crucial future elements of the peace process. We welcome the proposals on transitional justice brought forward by the Ethiopian government and the recent public consultations on this, including with civil society, and we encourage the government to establish an inclusive and transparent process to implement these provisions. Commissioners, thank you for your briefing today and for your important work investigating and documenting human rights violations and abuses committed by all sides during the conflict. We commend you for carrying out your work with a commitment to professionalism and impartiality. We reiterate our call on all parties to the conflict and regional partners to cooperate fully with your mandate. Now that the peace agreement is in place, how do you hope to work with the Ethiopian government, TPLF, and the African Union to ensure robust accountability for human rights violations and abuses? Thank you.
Thank you. And the next on my list is Spain.
Gracias, señor presidente. Thank you, President. Spain aligns itself with a statement made by the EU, and I'd like to thank the International Commission of Experts on Human Rights in Ethiopia for the oral update presented to the Council. Spain welcomes the peace agreement signed on the 2nd of November 2022, and we thank the African Union for leadership. We also praise the steps that were taken to implement this agreement, including the starting of the process of elaboration of a national framework of transitional justice and the cooperation established with the Office of the High Commissioner. We encourage Ethiopia to continue with this cooperation in order to ensure that everything is placed in line with international standards. Serious crimes that were committed by all parties to the conflict should be investigated in a very serious manner to avoid any situation of impunity. Only in this way can we have sustainable peace and reconciliation. Spain reiterates its readiness to support Ethiopia in the consolidation of peace through the application of mechanisms of transitional justice that will lead to truth, justice, and reparation to victims. Thank you.
Gracias. And we continue with Sudan. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. We associate with the African Group's statement. President, we take note of the observations and recommendations of the International Committee of Experts to investigate human rights violations in Ethiopia. Sudan welcomes the peace agreement and cessation of hostilities in Ethiopia signed in Pretoria in November 2022. And it commends the role of the African Union in reaching the agreement in what is a practical reflection of the principle of African solutions to African problems. And it renews its full support for the implementation of the terms of the agreement while encouraging the parties to the agreement to continue implementing its provisions in the same spirit that led them to sign the agreement. Sudan also calls on the international community to redouble efforts to respond to the humanitarian crisis in northern Ethiopia. Sudan commands Ethiopia's interaction and cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner, and it calls on the Office of the High Commissioner to provide technical assistance requested by Ethiopia in accordance with its national needs and priorities as part of its efforts to promote and protect human rights and strengthen the rule of law. Since the peace agreement has been signed, Mr. President, what are the steps that the Office of the High Commissioner undertakes in order to support the national priorities of Ethiopia? Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is South Sudan.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation aligns itself with the African Group statement and has taken note of the report. We welcome the unwavering commitment of the government of Ethiopia to address the conflict through the peaceful means and its commitment to ensure accountability and sustainable peace. We commend the bold decision of the government of Ethiopia in requesting the OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to deploy human rights monitors in the parts of the country affected by the conflict to provide support in the design and implementation of the transitional justice mechanism. We call on the international community to support the efforts of the government of Ethiopia and the efficiency of the national mechanism to restore peace and stability in the country. I thank you.
I thank you. Delegation of Niger is joining via Zoom.
Mr. President, my delegation takes note of the oral update of the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia. Niger aligns itself with the statement made by Côte d'Ivoire on behalf of the African Group. In our national capacity, Niger would like to praise the progress achieved by stakeholders in Ethiopia in order to reach sustainable peace, especially the agreement on sustainable peace and permanent cessation of hostilities signed on the 2nd of November 2022, and we encourage all stakeholders to fully implement the agreement. Niger welcomes the beginning of national consultations on political options in terms of transitional justice in Ethiopia and wish that this process be crowned with success. Also, Niger believes that all internal measures and mechanisms represent important tools for the consolidation of peace and stability in the country, something that is indispensable for the promotion and protection of human rights of all Ethiopians. Finally, my delegation would like to invite the High Commissioner to provide all the necessary assistance to Ethiopia to promote and protect human rights throughout the territory of the country. Thank you.
Merci à vous. Now let me invite Cuba.
Thank you very much, President. Cuba reiterates its rejection of the carrying out of these exercises in the Human Rights Council that do not enjoy the support of the concerned country. The Council should not apply double standards or politicizations in looking at human rights and should not apply any other singularizing practices that are targeting mostly developing countries. We reaffirm cooperation, dialogue, and respectful exchange of views of all countries on the basis of the principles of the UN Charter represent the only effective way to ensure the promotion and protection of human rights in the relevant multilateral bodies. Mr. President, we praise the progress and the commitment demonstrated by Ethiopia to overcome the challenges that it faces as a country in terms of sustainable development. We note that instead of establishing such mandates, we should focus on the respect and support of national efforts, initiatives related to technical cooperation that enjoy the support of the country concerned. Thank you.
And now a video statement by Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, Sri Lanka is of the view that the work of the Human Rights Council should adhere to the principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity and non-selectivity in the consideration of human rights issues and the elimination of double standards and politicization as stated in UNGA Resolution 60/251. We note that this resolution specifies that the methods of work of this Council should be transparent, fair and impartial, and also that genuine dialogue and cooperation is essential for the promotion and protection of all human rights, civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights, as well as the right to development. We therefore underline the need to recognize the measures taken by the government of Ethiopia to resolve the conflict through peaceful means and to extend their support to the national efforts in line with international obligations, norms and standards. We further highlight the importance of engaging in a genuine and constructive dialogue with the government of Ethiopia based on cooperation and mutual respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country. I thank you.
Thank you. Delegation of Eritrea, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Eritrea concurs and shares the views expressed by Cote d'Ivoire on behalf of the African Group and would like to add the following. The principles of neutrality, objectivity, and professionalism are key guiding principles of the deliberations of the Council, including in selecting mandate holders. The handpicking of certain commissioners who had already expressed their biased view on the subject matter is worrisome and can only intoxicate the report. Mr. President, an African-led Pretoria agreement has brought the 2-year-long brutal conflict in northern Ethiopia to an end. Ethiopia has embarked on a nationally owned process of national dialogue aimed at ensuring and comprehensive peace. The commitment and political will of the government and the efficiency of the national mechanisms need to be encouraged and supported towards lasting peace. I thank you.
Thank you, and let me invite Australia.
We thank the Commission for its oral update and reiterate our support for the Commission's mandate. Australia welcomes the African Union brokered peace agreement in Ethiopia. This landmark accord offers the Ethiopian people an opportunity to achieve enduring and lasting peace. We recognise the process made towards implementing the agreement. However, there is still significant work ahead. It is vital for all parties to the conflict to respect and uphold the commitment of the peace agreement. Australia is encouraged by improving humanitarian access in northern Ethiopia, yet notes many challenges remain. We urge all parties to continue working together to remove barriers to humanitarian assistance reaching all affected communities. We remain gravely concerned by the human rights abuses and violations committed during the conflict in Ethiopia. Reports of sexual and gender-based violence, extrajudicial killings, and the use of starvation against civilian populations must be fully investigated. As Ethiopia enters a process of reconciliation, a country-wide transitional justice framework would provide justice for victims and accountability for perpetrators of human rights abuses. We ask the Commission, how can the international community facilitate transitional justice in Ethiopia?
Thank you. Islamic Republic of Iran, you have the floor.
I thank you, Mr. President. Considering the realities on the ground in Ethiopia, we appreciate credible national efforts and governmental endeavors in returning complete normalcy in the country. We also encourage all parties in Ethiopia to continue their efforts for finding an inclusive solution through dialogue and advancing political reconciliation for lasting peace and prosperity for the people of Ethiopia. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran retains its fundamental position in rejecting country-specific mandates established by the Human Rights Council as an interference in domestic affairs of subjected countries. We strongly believe that establishment of country-specific resolutions and holding special sessions has spoiled the spirit of dialogue and cooperation as the guiding principles of promotion and protection of human rights by the Human Rights Council. This approach will be in vain, exhaust the resources of Human Rights Council, and affect negatively the efficiency of its work. Furthermore, the proliferation of bleak narrative about the situation of human rights in a country will only exacerbate the confrontation at national and international level. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm passing the floor to Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation aligns itself with the African Group statement delivered by Côte d'Ivoire and has taken note of the oral updates of the International Commission of Human Rights experts on Ethiopia. My delegation welcomes the unwavering commitment of the government of Ethiopia in addressing the conflict through peaceful means and its commitment to ensuring accountability and sustainable peace. In this regard, we applaud the agreement of lasting peace through a permanent cessation of hostilities signed in Pretoria, South Africa on the 2nd of November 2022. We believe that this agreement marks an important step in efforts to ensuring a peaceful and lasting solution to the conflict and call on the parties to continue to honor their commitment in this regard. We further commend the Ethiopian government for establishment of the Inter-Ministerial Task Force and the National Dialogue Commission geared towards ensuring sustainable peace in the country through healing and reconciliation. While recalling Resolution S33-1 establishing the mandate of the International Commission, we encourage the Commission to work closely with both Ethiopia Human Rights Commission and Joint Investigation Team of the Human OHCHR. We further invite all parties to engage in fruitful negotiations while encouraging their commitment to an African Union-led peaceful process. Finally, my delegation urges the international community to engage in a genuine constructive dialogue with the government of Ethiopia based on mutual respect and cooperation, and to support the national effort towards achieving peaceful security and human rights for all Ethiopians.
Passing the floor to Nigeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Nigeria aligns with the statement of the African Group and note the oral updates of the Independent Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia. We commend the strident efforts, commitment, and continuous cooperation of the esteemed government of Ethiopia with the OHCHR and other UN human rights mechanisms. My delegation further welcomes the African Union-led peace process that led in the signing of the agreement for lasting peace through permanent cessation of hostilities in Pretoria last year. We also commend the government of Ethiopia for their accountability measures, including the establishment of an inter-ministerial task force to implement the recommendations of joint investigation by the OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. Finally, we urge the Independent Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia to round off its mandate by September 2023, considering that the African Union-led process has achieved its objectives, a fact that has been echoed by statesmen all over the world, and most recently during the visit of the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken to the country. We therefore call on the international community to assist Ethiopia in furtherance of its developmental agenda. I thank you.
Thank you. And the last country on my list is Russian Federation. You have the floor.
Mr. Mr. President, we're carefully monitoring the situation in Ethiopia, including the military, political, and humanitarian situation in the region of Tigray. We welcome the signing in November of last year in Pretoria of the agreement between the government of Ethiopia and the TPLF, an agreement on a ceasefire. We note the steadfast contribution of mediators from African countries that provided significant assistance to the successful completion of negotiation in line with the principal African solutions to African problems. We take a positive view of the steps taken by the government of Ethiopia that are promoting inclusive national dialogue to resolve the main questions of the internal agenda. We welcome the resumption of humanitarian deliveries to Tigray and the return to normalcy in that part of the country. We find it important that Ethiopia continues its cooperation with the African Commission on Human Rights and also work related to investigating the deaths of civilians and other crimes committed during military activities in Tigray. We take a positive view of the role played by the European Human Rights Commission. Russia will continue to provide Ethiopia political diplomatic assistance in order to further stabilize the situation in the country. Thank you.
With non-governmental organizations, and the first on my list is Amnesty International. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Amnesty International expresses its full support for the work carried out by the Commission. Despite constant attacks on its mandate and funding, the Commission was able to deliver its initial report in September 2022. It remains the only credible investigation on one of the world's worst human rights and humanitarian situations. We express deep concern over Ethiopia's refusal to grant access to the Commission and its continued attempt to undermine the mandate of the Commission. Mr. President, the Council should protect the mandate of the Commission and send a clear message to the Ethiopian authorities that it will not abandon victims and survivors in Ethiopia in their quest for justice and accountability. The human rights situation in Ethiopia's Tigray region continues to be deeply concerning. In this region, reports of conflict-related sexual violence, extrajudicial executions, torture, and abduction by Eritrean forces continue despite the cessation of hostilities agreement. Finally, we ask members of the Commission the following question. Considering the government's repeated denial of credible allegations of international crimes committed by all actors, including by the Eritrean government, deep-rooted culture of impunity and weak domestic legal infrastructure, such as the absence of provision on crimes against humanity, what prospects do you see for justice and accountability at the domestic level? Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Human Rights Watch.
Thank you. 4 months after the signing of the cessation of hostilities agreement, grave violations that led to the establishment of this Council's Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia continue, highlighting its ongoing essential role. Eritrean forces remain in Tigray and have continued to commit widespread killings and sexual violence. In Western Tigray, Amhara regional forces and interim authorities have forcibly expelled hundreds of Tigrayans from the zone in just the last months. Government forces and armed groups also commit serious abuses in other parts of the country. In Oromia, a 4-year-long counterinsurgency campaign has targeted civilians and aid workers. In different regions, authorities have also responded to largely peaceful protests with excessive and at times lethal force. Many abuses are obscured by the government's restrictions on media and rights reporting. The authorities recently shut down social media platforms and arrested journalists and rights defenders. Particularly telling of the government attempt to control investigations that could implicate perpetrators at the highest levels have been its blocking of the international and regional human rights investigations, including its calls to terminate the Commission's mandate mid-term. As people throughout the country continue to suffer abuses and express mistrust in state institutions, credible, impartial and independent investigations remain critical. The Council should support the countless victims, survivors and their families across Ethiopia who seek justice, redress and public acknowledgement of their suffering. Thank you.
Thank you. And we continue with East and Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project.
Commissioners, we welcome the peace agreement whereby parties agreed to a cessation of hostilities to end the Tigray war. We also welcome the disarmament process. We call for the full restoration of services and unhindered humanitarian access. We stress, however, that accountability cannot be swept under the carpet. Violations, some of which may amount to crimes under international law, have not been adequately addressed. We also express our deep concern over violence in other regions, including Oromia. Ethiopia needs a roadmap to ensure accountability. The joint OHCHR-EHRC investigation team, domestic investigations, and international efforts are not mutually exclusive but complementary. In this regard, the International Commission of Human Rights Experts, which will present a report at HRC 54, plays an important role. It is important to keep hearing from the Commission since in the country, restrictions on rights, arbitrary detentions and harassments of human rights defenders and journalists, both online and offline, and particularly targeting women HRDs remain significant impediments to civic and democratic space. Independent actors continue to face undue restrictions. The culture of impunity remains a rampant problem. Mr. President, the Council should keep all options on the table to ensure follow-up, irrespective of the parameters to this follow-up and of the mechanism that will ensure follow-up. Continued monitoring and reporting is a must for a situation that remains one of the most serious in Africa. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next intervention is from the floor, Physicians for Human Rights.
Esteemed experts, Physicians for Human Rights presents this intervention in partnership with healthcare professionals operating inside Tigray, Ethiopia, and the Health Professionals Network for Tigray. As you are aware, the health system in Tigray has all but collapsed, and more than 7 million people are left without access to basic health care. The flow of humanitarian aid and medical supplies into the region is heavily constrained, leaving healthcare workers unable to care for their patients. Compared to the pre-war rates, maternal mortality is now 5 times higher, while the under-5 mortality is twice as high. Tens of thousands of civilians have experienced conflict-related sexual violence over more than 2 years and require significant medical and psychosocial support. Due to vaccine and medication shortages, there are outbreaks of infectious and communicable diseases, and non-communicable diseases go untreated. Unless adequate supplies reach affected areas of Ethiopia unimpeded, the health crisis will only deteriorate further. Therefore, esteemed experts, considering the allegations against the Ethiopian government, how can the Ethiopian government and transitional justice mechanisms provide accountability and redress for the destruction of the healthcare system? And how can the international community best facilitate an urgent humanitarian response in all affected areas?
Thank you very much. Every casualty worldwide. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Chair of the Commission, every casualty counts. The Amara Association of America and the Tigray War Database Project at Ghent University have been documenting deaths from the ongoing armed violence in Tigray and surrounding areas for several years. Allegations of massacres and other unlawful killings frequently come to light only via social media or testimonies of refugees and internally displaced persons, which are gathered by civil society casualty recorders. Can the Commission comment on the approach it is taking to gather and verify detailed information on massacres and other unlawful killings? Will the Commission conduct further investigations into massacres mentioned in the EHRC-OHCHR Joint Investigation Report, such as the killing of at least 11 villagers in Grizana in March 2021? In June last year, the Commission warned the Council that it lacked adequate resources to fulfill its mandate thoroughly, highlighting its inability to conduct urgent and thorough investigations into massacres of Amhara civilians in Oromia region. Does the Commission now have sufficient resources to investigate war crimes and other atrocities in all regions affected by armed violence, including Afar, Amhara, Benishangul Gumuz, Oromia, Somali, and Tigray? Thank you.
Thank you. And we continue with a video intervention by Coordination des associations et des particuliers pour la liberté de conscience.
We remain deeply concerned about the massacres and attacks on Amhara civilians in East Williga region. The attacks were mainly carried out by government forces, and the victims were mostly women, children, and the elderly. The attacks took place for a month since November 13, 2022 until December 3, 2022. 280 Amhara civilians were confirmed dead on December 3. Nearly 20,000 people managed to escape. There are currently close to 1 million Amhara displaced to escape ethnic-based massacres from Benshangul Gumuz, Williga, and North Shira. The government continues the mass arrest of Amaras. There are currently close to 12,000 Amara youth in prison, including Zemene Kassié. Shintayewu Shekol was arrested at least 4 times since July 22, and Thaddeus Tantu has been languishing in prison for more than a year. Prisoners are held in inhuman conditions, subjected to harassment, beating, and sexual abuse. In Addis Ababa, currently close to 500 Amaras houses were demolished. As a result, 9 children died due to attack by hyenas. It is imperative that the situation suffered by Amaras be considered by the Commission and the Council so that this exaction be officially investigated.
Thank you. And now, Christian Solidarity Worldwide. You have the floor.
Is it on? Great. Thank you, Mr. President. CSW thanks the Commission for its update. The situation in Tigray remains dire amid reports of mass destruction of civilian structures and appalling levels of SGBV. We're concerned by the continuing presence of Eritrean troops, Amhara regional forces, and Fano militia, all of which are implicated in large-scale commission of the gravest international crimes. Particularly alarming are reports of a renewed troop build-up by Eritrea, which has reportedly trained around 50,000 Fano militia and is continuing collaboration with the Ethiopian army, which is responsible for the safety of Tigrayan civilians following the disarming of the TDF. Persistent reports of looting, extrajudicial killings, SGBV, and other egregious violations by occupying armed factions, and emerging evidence of earlier severe violations committed under cover of communications blackouts underline the importance of the Commission's work. We therefore urge Member States to ensure the Commission's mandate is maintained for as long as required and its work is funded sufficiently. We reject inferences that this international mechanism, which is independent of parties to the conflict, undermines the peace process. Lasting peace can never be achieved in the absence of justice. Thus, we call on Ethiopia to cooperate with the Commission, facilitate access to every conflict-affected area, thereby combating impunity by ensuring tangible progress towards holding identified perpetrators accountable. We also call for the complete withdrawal of Eritrean and Amhara forces and militia from Tigray, and for the AU monitoring, verification and compliance mission
Thank you very much. You've exhausted your time, and we will continue with a video statement by International Bar Association.
The IBA's Human Rights Institute, the ABARI, welcomes this opportunity to engage in this interactive dialogue with the International Commission of Human Rights experts on Ethiopia. The ABARI is concerned about reports of rape and sexual violence in Ethiopia, which continue despite the peace deal signed in November 2022. According to data from the Tigray Health Bureau in November and December 2022, 852 cases of rape and sexual violence were reported by survivors. Recent investigations show that most of these assaults in Tigray were committed by Eritrean troops. It is crucial that all evidence of rape and sexual violence is investigated and those responsible are brought to justice. Furthermore, as the use of rape and sexual violence bears the hallmarks of genocide, it is crucial to examine the issue and explore how states are to implement their duties under the Genocide Convention. It is therefore crucial that the International Commission of Human Rights experts on Ethiopia continues its work and that the UN not only extends its mandate but also expands it to enhance its engagements with a view and ensuring accountability. The IBARI calls for independent investigations of the issue of rape and sexual violence in the region, state and international actors to provide assistance to survivors, including for the physical and mental injuries sustained, and states enhance support to the International Commission of Human Rights experts on Ethiopia. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next video is by Civicus.
Thank you, Mr. President. Civicus welcomes the recent renewal of the International Commission of Human Rights experts on Ethiopia's mandate. We also welcome the signing of the agreement on the cessation of hostilities between the Ethiopian government and Tigrayan authorities on the 2nd of November 2022. This is a critical moment to end all atrocities and the suffering of millions of civilians. For the past 2 years, Ethiopia's human rights situation has been marred by extrajudicial killings, rape and sexual violence, unlawful shelling, airstrikes and pillage. Freedom of expression has particularly been restricted, which with journalists and media actors facing detentions, arrest and censorship from both Ethiopian and Tigrayan authorities. On the 7th of September 2022, the founder and editor of The Voice of Amhara was arrested by authorities at his home. He was accused of having ties with the TLPF and attempting to terrorize the public by disseminating information that supports the rebel group. No formal charges were laid against him. In the same month, Abe Zewdu, the chief editor for privately owned satellite and YouTube-based broadcaster Amara Media Center, was arrested by Ethiopian authorities. He was accused of disseminating false information and organizing students from the Amhara ethnic group to commit violence. He remained in detention even after he had posted bail. We call on the Ethiopian government to respect the right to freedom of expression and to seize all forms of intimidation and harassment of journalists and other media actors. We urge the UN Human Rights Council and the Commission of Experts to continue scrutinizing the situation in Ethiopia to ensure peace and stability in the country. We thank you.
Thank you. And the last speaker I'll be able to accommodate during this dialogue is International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Commission on Human Rights for its report and update on the crisis. Since November 2020, violations such as extrajudicial killings, rape, sexual violence, and starvation of the civilian have been committed in Ethiopia. Tigrayan forces killed civilians and damaged or destroyed civilian infrastructure and property in Koba and Chena in August and September 2021. Killings were accompanied by additional acts of violence and brutality such as beatings and rapes of women. The effect of rape and sexual violence on survivors has been enormous. They face devastating long-term impacts on their physical and mental health. Conflict has led to displacement, lack of essential services for populations. There is a dire need of humanitarian assistance and protection for 20 million people suffering in the country. Effort in Geneva International Center for Justice urge Ethiopia to investigate and bring to justice members of its forces who have committed serious violations of international human rights law and humanitarian law. The described violations amount to crimes against humanity, and we strongly condemn the brutal abuses and violations of international humanitarian law. The Ethiopian government urgently needs to commit to peace negotiations in order to bring an end to the conflict. Thank you.
I thank you. And now let me give the floor back to the Ambassador of Ethiopia. Excellency, you have 2 minutes and 10 seconds.
Mr. President, after listening to the comments from different delegations, I'll just make the following additional points. Number one, as I have stated earlier, the transitional justice mechanism will be important in ensuring accountability and redress. Number two, the government has been taking concrete steps to expedite humanitarian assistance to people of concern and restore public services. This has enabled humanitarian actors to provide unhindered and unfettered humanitarian assistance. The government is also taking measures to restore critical infrastructure. Number three, it is to be recalled that the government of Ethiopia has previously invited the Commission to Addis Ababa to explore modalities for cooperation by building upon the report of the joint investigation by OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. Unfortunately, the Commission was not ready to engage constructively in accordance with its mandate. Number four, going forward, the international community could best support Ethiopia in redoubling its support to the transitional justice-related process. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. And now let me invite Mr. Mohammed Chande Otmar, Mr. Ratner, for concluding remarks. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Each of us will respond in turn to the comments from member states and other states and the non-governmental organizations. I'd like to address the issues of regarding engagement with the government of Ethiopia on transitional justice and their transitional justice processes, including those concerning accountability raised by the EU, the US, Canada, Netherlands, UK, Australia, and a number of NGOs. From our perspective, transitional justice is first and foremost a national responsibility. At the same time, it is governed by international and regional standards and best practices that will benefit any state that engages in this process. That policy, we all recognize, should flow from genuine consultations with all relevant stakeholders, including, of course, and most importantly, the victims of the conflict. We note that Ethiopia has begun now and is at the beginning of such a process. And for us, as members of this commission, it represents an opportunity in the coming months for us and others to engage with them in a constructive manner regarding the international and regional standards and best practices. We look forward to such engagement in a cooperative and constructive manner. The ultimate goals of that process remain the same, whatever mechanism the Ethiopian people and government decide to choose. Accountability and justice for those who have committed international crimes, truth and acknowledgement for the victims, remedies and redress for them, and the establishment of mechanisms to ensure non-repetition of these abuses in the future. We look forward to active engagement with the government of Ethiopia in the spirit of constructive engagement. And we believe there is a role for members of this council to assist us in carrying out this important part of our mandate.
Thank you very much. Let me say that along with everyone in this room, we welcome the peace agreement, the Pretoria peace agreement, especially this commission. And I want to reiterate our chairperson's call for dialogue and consultation with all parties, especially the federal government of Ethiopia, as a high priority. I would also like to highlight Commissioner Ratner's comments that the Commission will try and fulfill its mandate on transitional justice by trying to work with the government, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, and others involved in the transitional justice process. My duty here then is to answer some of the questions raised by member states as well as NGOs by trying to remind ourselves of the primary goal of this commission and of the transitional justice process, which is to provide redress to victims and to survivors, and to answer their call to justice. An independent international commission working with domestic mechanisms has always been one way of ensuring this. The Human Rights Council has often relied on this practice. It is important that this important principle and practice is protected in the work of the Human Rights Council. Our members have been listening to testimonies to victims. It is important that their voices are heard without fear or uncertainty. Witness protection is a key element of any justice process. Our Commission wishes to contribute as much as possible to the healing process in Ethiopia. The international community, the African Union, must partner with Ethiopia to bring about a durable, sustainable peace. Thank you.
Yeah, just to conclude, Mr. Chairman, the central question by a number of delegates is how can the Human Rights Council and the international community support the work of the Commission to deliver fully on its mandate by the end of its current tenure. I think one of the major ways in which the member states, including members of the African Union, can support the Commission deliver fully the mandate is really to impress upon Ethiopia to reconsider engagement with the Commission. Whatever modalities, we are prepared for those modalities, and to continue to be able so that we can work together constructively, really, so that come September, we deliver a fully comprehensive mandate as you have urged us. I thank you very much.
Thank you. This is the end of this interactive dialogue, and I thank you all for your participation. We will now take a short break before the oral update of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. We will continue in a minute, so please do not leave the room. Thank you.